Good morning and welcome to St. Francis. We continue our study this morning in the Gospel of Mark, looking at the life of Jesus. And here in Mark chapter 9, we come to the Transfiguration, a beautiful, magnificent event. But what's going on here and what can we learn from the Transfiguration? Well, centuries earlier in the book of Exodus, the nation of Israel was gathered around Mount Sinai. God comes down on Mount Sinai. We see a cloud. God speaks out of the cloud. So there's the voice of God out of the cloud. Everyone is afraid. The nation of Israel was kept at a distance. If anybody touched the mountain, they would die. Moses goes up to the top of the mountain and he says this to God. He says, "Show me your glory. Show me your perfect, infinite, eternal, bright greatness and beauty." But God says to Moses in Exodus 33, "You can't see my face and live. But when my glory passes by, I'll put you in the cleft of the rock. I'll cover you with my hand until I pass by. Then I'll take my hand away, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." Moses wasn't able to see the glory of God, but even being close to God on Mount Sinai meant that Moses' face shone with the reflected glory of God's presence. Now, centuries later, there's another mountain. There's dazzling heavenly brightness. Their clothing that they wore of Moses, Elijah, and Jesus was so intensely white, it was whiter than anyone on earth could bleach them. So there's this heavenly brightness. There's glory, a cloud, a voice speaks out of the cloud. Even Moses is there. This is Mount Sinai all over again, right? Well, no. Moses reflected the glory of God like the moon reflects the light of the sun. Here, Jesus produces the glory of God. Jesus is the source of the glory. It emanates from him. The unapproachable glory of God that Moses couldn't even look at comes from Jesus. What this means is that Jesus doesn't point to the glory of God like Moses or Elijah or the leaders of other world religions. Jesus doesn't point to the glory of God. Jesus is the glory of God. Hebrews 1 verse 3 says, Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God. Jesus is the exact imprint of God's nature. What this means is that Jesus is the exact, unsurpassable representation of God. Jesus is the glory of God in human form. So, the Transfiguration and the other claims of Jesus, they just don't tell us that Jesus is another nice teacher we might want to follow. If these claims and these events are not true, then you have to reject Jesus, just as one more megalomaniac like David Koresh. But if his claims are true, if these events are true, then you don't just follow Jesus. He has to be the very center of your life, the object of all your worship. Now on Mount Sinai, when God's glory came down, his Shekinah glory came down, the glory of God was hidden in a cloud, and God speaks out of the cloud. Moses couldn't look on God's face. There was an infinite gap between humanity and God. And that gap was symbolized with a cloud. In Genesis, Adam and Eve, after they sin and their shame, they hide themselves from God. What we see in the rest of Hebrew Scripture is that God hides himself from humanity in a cloud. Because if we come into direct contact with God's glory, we would be destroyed. That's why Peter here is so scared. He is scared to death. When Peter in verse 5 suggests building 3 tents, one for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, Peter isn't just feeling uncomfortable or a little bit awkward in this situation. It says he was terrified. He was trembling, full of fear. Now, this doesn't make any sense for us until we understand that the Greek word for tent is tabernacle. On Mount Sinai, after God's glory came down, the people built a tabernacle. Why? Well, all religions understand that there's an infinite gap between humanity and God. So humanity builds tabernacles. We build temples with priests who offer sacrifices to mediate between humanity and God. A tabernacle protects us. It protects us from the raw presence, power, and glory of God. That's why Peter says, I need a tabernacle. I need something to contain, to mediate, to protect me from the raw presence of God's glory. But then the Shekinah glory cloud of God's presence appears, the cloud from Mount Sinai. It must have completely freaked Peter out at that point. And a voice speaks from within the cloud saying, probably the last thing that Peter expected, saying, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Notice Peter, James, and John, they don't die. They live. Suddenly the cloud is gone. Moses is gone. Elijah is gone. Only Jesus remains. What this tells us is that Jesus isn't the God on the other side of the chasm. Jesus is the personal bridge over the chasm. He's the final temple, the last tabernacle, where we meet God personally. He's the final sacrifice, the final priest. He's the end of all priests, the end of all mediators, of all sacrifices. And through Jesus, the infinite presence, the glory of God comes to us personally and envelops us. These disciples were enveloped by the presence of God. They didn't die. They heard God the Father speak about his love for his Son, Jesus. And suddenly it's all gone. And they realize that only Jesus gives what Moses can't, what Elijah can't, what all the prophets can't give. Only Jesus gives access to the very heart, the very presence of God. Jesus is the object of our worship. Notice, Jesus, Peter, James, and John, they come down from the mountain. What do they find? Well, they're met by a demon. The scribes are arguing. We don't know what they're arguing about. The other disciples are trying to cast out a demon, but they're not having any success. It's absolute chaos. They're surrounded by evil. Everyone is confused. In Exodus, when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, the people are worshiping an idol. The leadership is confused and compromised. It's chaos. This is Mark's way of telling us that the mountaintop experience that we have with God is important, but the majority of our life is lived in the chaos of the valley on our way to the cross. But notice, Jesus in verse 9 tells the disciples not to mention the transfiguration until after his resurrection. Why? Because no one would believe it. Because the transfiguration is a glimpse or a foretaste of the resurrection. It's a foretaste of his second coming. It happened, it was brief, and the rest of the life of Jesus was one long journey to the cross where Jesus would suffer and die. And Mark isn't just saying that this is true for Jesus, that only Jesus has a mountaintop experience and then lives in the valley on his way to the cross. Jesus wants his disciples to know that this is true for us, that life is one long journey to the cross. That's why he says, in this world you'll have suffering and tribulation and challenges. That's life. Now, many of us, we tend to think that if we're smart or if we work hard or if we're moral enough, we're not going to suffer. Secular people, they say that if you suffer, you probably just are not very smart. Religious people, they say that if you suffer, you're probably not very good. You have some unconfessed sin in your life, perhaps. Jesus said, "I took up my cross, you take up your cross. The world hated me, the world will hate you. I had to suffer before I got to resurrection. You will have to suffer too." This is the fundamental truth of being a follower of Jesus. Jesus is saying that at some point, we all need mountaintop experiences. We need to access worship of God. We need to access the presence of God through Jesus. We need to be embraced by his presence and love. We need a foretaste of the resurrection. We need a foretaste of his second coming, of the new heaven and the new earth, a foretaste of being embraced by God the Father. Because in the midst of suffering, if we have this foretaste in worship, in the Eucharist, and in God's Word, we need to have this foretaste because otherwise we're not going to make it on our journey to the cross. will become self-absorbed, hard, angry, resentful, and discouraged. But with this foretaste, knowing the embrace of God the Father and the love that we have in Jesus, we will become more beautiful, gracious, and courageous men and women, even in the midst of suffering. So how do we access the presence of Jesus? How do we access this mountaintop experience that will sustain us on our journey? Well, very briefly, I just want to highlight three things that we see in this text. When Jesus, Peter, James, and John, when they came down from the mountain, they find that the other disciples are trying to cast this demon out of a boy. And in verse 29, it says that they were trying to do it without praying. They were really incredibly arrogant in their inadequacy. In verse 14, the teachers of the law, they're arguing. We're not sure what they're arguing about, but they're probably arguing about the way that the disciples were going about their work. They were very arrogant in their arguing and their criticism. But notice, the only person who acknowledges that he doesn't have what it takes is this boy's dad. Jesus asks this dad, "How long has this been happening to your boy?" And the dad says, "From childhood. But if you can do anything, have compassion and help us." Jesus says, "All things are possible for the one who believes." And immediately this dad cries out and says, "I'm trying, Jesus, but I am absolutely riddled with doubts." Then Jesus heals. So, what do we learn from this father about how to access God's presence in Jesus? Well, the first thing we learn is this, and this is so key, is that helplessness, not holiness, is the first step to accessing the presence of God in Jesus. Helplessness, not holiness. Jesus doesn't say to this guy, "Come on, man, get your act together. And when you do, then you come back to me and I'll bless you and I'll deal with your son." No, Jesus sees this man's helplessness and Jesus heals his son. When you and I say, "Jesus, I've lived a faithful life. I've checked all the boxes. Now bless me," that's faith in ourselves. That's not faith in Jesus. But the boy's father says, "I'm riddled with doubts. I'm full of fears. I can't muster the strength to meet this moral and spiritual challenge. So help me, Jesus, because I'm helpless." This man's faith was completely in Jesus and not in himself. And God's power was released. All religions, they say, give God a good record of past performance and past obedience, and then God owes you. God will bless you. The gospel says God has blessed us. He gave us by grace at an infinite cost to himself a perfect record through his son, Jesus Christ. Now we obey out of love. This man said, "I don't have the faith. I don't have what it takes. I'm weak and helpless." Jesus says, "I can work with that." This is saving faith. It's a way of saying, accept me, not because of who I am, but because of who you are. Not because of what I've done, but because of what you've done. Helplessness, not holiness. The second thing, we're to handle the journey of life to the cross and access the presence of God in Jesus. We must bring Jesus, we must surrender to Jesus the most precious things in our lives. This man brought to Jesus the most precious thing that he had, his son, and he surrendered his son to Jesus. The things in our life where we try to find our significance and purpose, perhaps our career, success, children, relationships, achievements, health, whatever it is, when these things go wrong in life, which they will go wrong, if we've not surrendered our most precious things to Jesus, when things are threatened, when things are taken away, we don't just weep or sad. We are absolutely crushed and hopeless and become bitter. We enter into despair. So if we are to handle the journey of life to the cross and access the presence of Jesus, We must bring to Jesus and surrender to Jesus the most precious things in our lives. Third, if we're to handle the journey of life to the cross and access the presence of God in Jesus, we must know the love of God, the Father, for his Son. In the Transfiguration, when the cloud came down on the mountain and the voice of the Father was heard, God the Father said, "This is my Son whom I love." What we see here is that at the very heart, the very center of the glory of God is the love of God the Father for God the Son. The disciples were surrounded by this love. On the cross, Jesus, interestingly, doesn't call out to his Father, which he did every other time. On the cross, Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" On the mountain, he's surrounded by the love of his Father. On the cross, Jesus is forsaken. On the mountain, he's embraced, he is clothed with the love of his Father, surrounded with light, surrounded with God's glory. On the cross, he's stripped naked, covered with shame, surrounded by darkness. Why did Jesus make this exchange? Well, in Romans chapter 8, Paul says, "The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God." What Paul is saying here is that through faith in what Jesus accomplished for us on the cross, we can actually hear what God the Father said to Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. The Spirit of God says, and we hear it in our hearts, "You are my beloved daughter. You are my beloved son. I love you, and I've gone to infinite depths. I've known suffering, loss, and death. So in exchange, you can have life, and you can know my infinite, radical love for you." If you have accessed the presence of God in Jesus through helplessness, not through holiness, if you surrender to Jesus your most precious thing, and if you see Jesus losing everything, being stripped of everything in exchange for you, that you might gain access to the unconditional, radical love of God, then you will be able to endure the valleys. You will be able to endure the suffering of life on your way to the cross. And you will endure it with grace and hope, with confidence in God's faithfulness and love, with confidence in the resurrection.